Who was John F. Kennedy? By Yona McDonough. The small boat sped quickly along in the dark. It was a hot night in August. The 13 men on board were quiet and tense. Their mission was a scary one. They were looking for Japanese warships in the Pacific Ocean. Suddenly, there was an explosion. The small boat was ripped in half by a Japanese destroyer returning to its base. 2 of the crew were killed instantly. The other 11 men clung to pieces of the boat until morning. Then the wreckage began to sink. The captain decided they all must swim to the safety of a nearby island. The men didn't think they could make it. "Will we ever get out of this?" asked one. "It can be done," replied the captain. "We'll do it." One of the men was burned so badly he could not swim. He told the captain to save himself and the other men, but the captain would not leave the wounded man. He swam for 5 long hours with the burned man on his back. When they reached the island, the captain discovered 2 natives in a canoe. He also discovered a coconut shell on which he carved these words: "Native knows post-it, he can't pilot 11 alive. Need small boat, Kennedy." He gave the shell with the message to the islanders who went by canoe to another island nearly 40 miles away. 6 days after the patrol boat was destroyed, the brave and quick-thinking captain and his crew were rescued. The captain's name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Chapter 1. Little Boy, Big Family. On May 29, 1970, a baby boy was born to Joseph P. Kennedy, a wealthy American businessman, and his wife Rose. They named him John Fitzgerald Kennedy in honor of Rose's father, John F. Fitzgerald. Honey Fitz, as he called, had been a popular politician and a former mayor of Boston. When his daughter Rose began dating the young Kennedy boy, Honey Fitz was not so sure he approved. But the complete kept seeing each other, and eventually Honey Fitz was won over by Joe's hard-working, ambitious nature. Irish immigration to the United States. In the 1840s and 1850s, more than 1 million Irish immigrants sailed to America. Back in Ireland, the potato crop had failed. Without their staple food, at least 1 million people died of starvation and disease. The immigration who came here were crammed into crowded, dirty ships. Nearly 20% of them died before they arrived. The ones who did were called the Famine Irish. Like many new immigrant groups, they faced discrimination and hatred. They could not easily find jobs or places to live. Signs with the words "Irish need not apply" were common. They took the only work they could get, laying railroad tracks, shoveling coal, digging canals, and clearing swamps. Both the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds were descended from Irish immigrants. The immigrants had come to Boston, Massachusetts to escape the terrible potato famine of the 1840s in the United States. Both families had done well. Nicknamed Jack, John was the second of Rose and Joseph Kennedy's 9 children. They lived in a comfortable clapboard house in Brookline, a town just outside Boston. The other Kennedy kids. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. was Joseph and Rose Kennedy's first son, born in 1915. John Fitzgerald, known as Jack, was born in 1970. Rosemary was born in 1918. Kathleen, known as Kik, was born in 1920. Eunice came in 1921. Patricia was born in 1924. Robert, known as Bobby, came along in 1925. Jean Ann was born in 1928. The 9th and last Kennedy baby, Edward, known as Teddy, was born in 1932. When Jack was 2.5 years old, he got scarlet fever, a deadly illness. It was so contagious that Jack had to be separated from his mother and baby sister Kathleen. Jack missed his mother a lot. To take his mind off her, his Irish nanny Chico Conby told him wonderful stories about leprechauns and fairies. Usually Jack loved stories, but he was so sick he could hardly listen. Instead, he clutched his favorite teddy bear tightly and drifted in and out of sleep. Jack didn't get better. His parents rushed him to a hospital in Boston. Strange doctors and nurses came and went all the time. There was no one he knew. He spent weeks in the hospital fighting for every breath. His worried parents hoped and prayed that their little boy would get well again. Though Jack survived, he was a weak, often sickly child. He suffered from colds, flu, stomach aches, and allergies, as well as serious illnesses like bronchitis and diphtheria. To while away the long, boring days spent in bed, he read many books, one after another. His favorite was the story about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Here was a story in which he could get lost. The noble king and his brave men and their desire to uphold truth, honesty, and justice. Jack's copy grew tattered from so much use. When he was not sick in bed, Jack tried to be more like his older brother, Joe Jr. Joe was taller, stronger, smarter, and faster. He could do everything better. How could Jack compete? Jack knew that his father liked winners. There was no tolerance for losers or crybabies. In the Kennedy family, to please his father, Jack always played to win, even if it meant putting himself in danger. Once, his brother Joe dared him to compete in a bicycle race, but this was no ordinary race. They would ride in different directions and circle around. When they met up again, the one to swerve first was the loser. Joe was sure Jack would be the first to lose his nerve, but Jack was determined faster and he pedaled, heading straight for his brother. Finally, the two boys were almost face to face. Instead of swerving, Jack recklessly crashed head on with Joe. He was taken to the hospital where he had to get 28 stitches, but he refused to lose his nerve in front of Joe. That's how much winning meant to him. It seemed Jack couldn't please of his parents. Rose spent a lot of time away from her children. She made trips to Europe to buy latest fashions. Jack's mother was always scolding him for how sloppy he looked. His t-shirt was never tucked in. His collar stood up. He was often late for meals, but the family cook took pity on him and fed him in the kitchen. When Jack was 5, Rose planned a three-week trip to California with her sister. Years later, he said, "My mother was never there when we really needed her. My mother never really held me and hugged me." Jack's father was more fun. In 1929, when Jack was 12, Joe Kennedy bought a large white summer house with green shutters. It was in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. On Cape Cod, the house was practically on the beach facing the Atlantic Ocean. It had a private tennis court and a swimming pool. Jack's father ran the place like a big summer camp. Every morning the Kennedy kids had to exercise out in the lawn. They were drilled by a full-time gym instructor. They were swimming races. Even the kids who were 6 and 7 took part. As the children got older, they were taught to sail. Football games were played on the lawn, and anyone who visited had to join in. And around Hyannisport, everyone knew that the Kennedys always played to win. Thanks to Joe's shrewd head for business, the Kennedy family was rich, and they were growing richer. Making money was important to Joe Kennedy, and he worked very hard at it. He had graduated from Harvard in 1912 and into banking in 1914. At the age of 25, he became one of the youngest bank presidents in the country. He also had begun to invest in the stock market. He was good at that too, and built a fortune from his investments. Later on, he began to buy and sell land. He went to Hollywood and dabbled in the motion picture industry. He met the famous actors and actresses who started in the films. He also made money from distribution of liquor. In fact, people said he made money selling liquor illegally from 1920 to 1933, was the time as known prohibition. During those years, it was against the law to sell beer, wine, or hard liquor. Despite the money Joe made, many of Boston's oldest and most respected families still looked down on him. They thought that Joe's in the 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect, prohibiting or making it illegal to sell or drink wine, beer, and alcohol. Some people felt drinking alcoholic beverages was immoral. Others felt that prohibition would put a stop to alcohol's bad influence on family life. But what happened was that prohibition encouraged crime on a scale never before seen in America. Smuggling, alcohol, bottle egging became a tag business. People brewed their own alcohol at home. Organized crime, which controlled most of the illegal liquor trade, thrived. By 1933, the government repealed the 18th Amendment and alcohol was illegal once more. Personally, the coarse and crude they had was a prejudice against Irish immigrants. Unlike the oldest families in Boston who were Protestants. The Irish were Catholics. Many Irish had been very poor when they first came to America. Joe worked hard not only to become rich, but also to overcome the negative attitudes people had about him and his family. He wanted his children to have the best and to be the best too. He would show stuffy, stuck-up Boston just how good the Irish and the Kennedys could be. Yet Joe and Rose wanted their children to understand the value of $1, which their allowance. The young Kennedy children were expected to buy birthday and Christmas gifts for the family. When Jack was 10, his allowance was 40 cents. At that time, an ice cream sundae cost 10 cents, a comic book 5, but Jack had become a Boy Scout, needed more money, so he wrote his father a letter. When I am a scout, I have to buy canteens, haversacks, blankets, so I put in a plea for raise of 30 cents for me to buy scout things and pay my own way more around. Joe was swayed by his son's reasoning. He saved the letter and gave Jack the raise. In fall of 1930, Jack went off to prep school Canterbury in Connecticut, but he had a tough time of it. Often lonely and homesick, he came down with a fever of 105 and a terrible case of hives. Over Easter break, the family doctor decided to remove Jack's appendix. He didn't recover well from the operation. He never went back to Canterbury. Instead, for the next fall, Jack followed his brother Joe to Choi, a boarding school in Connecticut. Jack was neither an outstanding student nor athlete. He loved reading about history and he loved to write. He was the only boy at school to subscribe to the New York Times, and he was a whiz at trivia questions or a popular weekly radio quiz program called Information Please. Contestants had to answer questions on a wide range of subjects. Jack was good as grown-ups on the program, and his school chums were impressed because of his reading. He knew about all kinds of things. Still, Jack found it hard having Joe as an older brother. When he was grown, Jack said Joe was the star of the family. He did everything better than the rest of us. This was frustrating for Jack. He didn't want to be compared to Joe. There was no way he could compete and win. Instead, it seemed as if Jack tried to be Joe's casual about schoolwork. If Joe were careful and cautious, Jack would be headstrong and reckless at the boarding school. Jack had helped from the Mockers Club. Club members dedicated themselves to playing pranks and practical jokes and just having fun, and Jack liked having fun. Joe may have been the model child who impressed his parents well as his brothers, sisters, with his grades and athletic skills. But Jack was the one who charmed his younger siblings with high spirits and zest for life. The younger Kennedy kids admired Joe. They adored Jack. Jack's favorite sister was Kathleen. They called her Kick. Smart, funny, and a little wild, Kick shared Jack's wicked sense of humor. There were times Jack felt lost in such a big family. He also loved his sisters and brothers deeply. There was a strong bond among them that lasted all their lives. Chapter 2, College Life. After Jack graduated from Choate, he decided not to go to Harvard University. That's where his father had gone. That's where his brother Joe was a student. Instead, he chose Princeton University. Again, Jack wanted to make his own way instead. Following in Joe's bigger footsteps, Jack wasn't happy at Princeton and soon transferred to Harvard. Although his grades were only average, he still dreamed of glory. Jack wanted to become a star athlete. He tried out for football team. During the practice, he hurt his back so badly he had to give up the game. Instead, he took up swimming. Was fun and it helped strengthen his back. He joined the swim team and wouldn't miss a practice even when he got sick. One time he snuck out of the infirmary when he was running a high fever just to practice. He didn't know that his strength as a swimmer one day would help him save a man's life. Despite average grades, Jack impressed his college teachers with his writing and thinking. Now his family began to see Jack in a new light. Perhaps he might become a reporter or a writer at Harvard. His personality made him stand out. Both boys and girls found him charming and funny. He was invited to join one of Harvard's elite clubs. It was a club that not offered Joe membership, yet beneath his sunny surface, Jack was often in severe pain because he was raised not to complain or cry. He almost never let anyone know how he suffered. In 1937, while Jack was still at Harvard, his father made an ambassador to Great Britain. The family moved to London during school breaks. Jack visited. He became fascinated with European politics. He saw the Germans gearing up for war as other nations anxiously watched. Hitler and World War II. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. He was a member of the Nazi Party and used violence and force to achieve his goals. Hitler dreamed of taking over the entire world. He started World War II by invading Poland in 1939. The Poles offered little resistance, and this was easy victory. Inspired by his success, Hitler invaded Denmark, Norway, France, Belgium, Holland, the Soviet Union, Luxembourg, Greece, and Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia. He tried to take over England, but the English resisted. Eventually, other countries like France, the United States, Canada, and the Soviet Union joined forces against Hitler, and he was defeated in 1945. Instead of going back to school, Jack took some time off. He spent spring semester of 1939 in Europe. He traveled to many countries, taking careful notes on what he saw, read, and heard. His travels opened his mind and his heart. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and World War II began. Jack returned to Harvard, but his time in Europe had changed him. Back at college, he became a serious student. He began to study as he had never studied before. He wrote one every long paper about why England was not prepared for the terrible war. When the paper was finished, he sent it to his father along with the letter said, "It represents more work than I've ever done in my life." Joseph Kennedy was very impressed by what he read. He thought Jack's paper was so good, he contacted a publisher. The publisher company agreed with him in 1940. Jack's book, Why England Slept, became a bestseller. A recent graduate, Jack was now considered an expert on world affairs. By the time the war was underway, Emperor Hirohito sided with Germany, France and Britain. Watched and waited through. They thought Germany they might be able to keep peace with Germany rather than fight. Then their strategy did not work. France and Britain declared war on Germany. Then, on December 1941, Japan attacked the American military base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Approximately 2,400 people were killed and over 1,100 wounded. The United States declared war on Japan. Japan was Germany's ally, so the United States was fighting Germany as well. For the boys and young men of his country, the long, hard fight had only just begun. Pearl Harbor. All the World War II had been going on in Europe since 1939. America had not become actively involved. All that changed on the morning of December 7, 1941, when the first wave of 189 Japanese bombers made a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in naval base in Hawaii within 2 hours. The planes had sunk or destroyed many American battleships and aircrafts. More than 2,000 sailors and soldiers were killed. The Japanese were fighting on the side of the Germans. By December 11, 1941, the United States had declared war on Japan, Italy, and Germany. Chapter 3. Both Jack and Joe wanted to fight in World War II. Joe was immediately accepted as a naval air cadet. Jack had to wait because of his poor health and an old back injury. He failed the physical exam, but Jack was determined to enlist and eventually into the U.S. Navy in the spring of 1943. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy was given command of PT-109, a patrol boat in the Pacific Ocean. PT stood for Patrol Torpedo. The boats were light and fast. The PT boat was made of plywood and only 80 feet long. Many people thought that they were perfect for nighttime missions to stop Japanese destroyers, but others disagreed. The PT boats were dangerous because they were so small and fragile. Some people felt the boats cost more lives than they saved. After 5 months in the Pacific Ocean searching for enemy ships, PT-109 was torn in half by a Japanese destroyer. Once Kennedy realized that the wrecked pieces of the boat would sink, he had ordered his men to swim to Bum Pudding Island. 3 miles away, Jack refused to leave Patrick McMahon, who was badly burned, to die alone. Instead, he placed Patrick on top of him. Back to back, Jack took the long strap from Patrick's life jacket, clenched it in his teeth, and he swam when they finally reached the shore. The end of Jack's strap was scarred with Jack's teeth marks. He swallowed it so much salt water the swim that he vomited and collapsed later. Aided by the 2 islanders' coconut shell he had carved, Jack was able to get help for his men. Other PT boats came to rescue them, and they were able to return to their base on August 8. Grateful to be alive, Jack was sent home. His time in the Navy had made his old back injury worse, and he had caught malaria. Malaria is a serious disease that caused fever, chills, sweating, and vomiting. He needed to rest and get well again. He was a hero now, and in 1944 he received medals from the U.S. Navy of his bravery. Yet he remained modest. Later on, a high school student asked him how he had become a hero. Jack replied, "It was absolutely involuntary. They sank my boat." Then in August of 1944, not long after Jack's safe return, the Kennedy family happiness was shattered. Joe Jr. was killed in a plane crash while on a dangerous wartime mission. It was the first of many tragedies to befall the Kennedy family. Though Jack and Joe had been rivals, they were also brothers. They shared a powerful bond, each knowing what it was like to be Joe Kennedy's son. Now Joe Jr. was gone. After Joe Jr.'s death, Joseph Kennedy pinned his robe on his back. Joseph had wanted his oldest son to become president of the first Catholic president ever. But now Joe Jr. was dead. Jack was next in line. He knew his father wanted him to run for office. He had made that very clear. But did Jack want a life in politics? It would take some soul searching to find out. Jack had imagined becoming a professor of a writer. Still, his father pressured. Joe's death and his own wartime experience changed Jack just 1 year after Joe's death. In 1946, Jack decided to run for Congress from Boston and Democratic ticket on the Democratic ticket. Or maybe decided not quite describe what happened. Here's what Jack said later. "It was like drafted. My father wanted his eldest son in politics. Wanted isn't the right word. He demanded it. If you know my father, Jack hoped to be congressman for Boston's 11th district. It was the seat in Congress Honeyfitz, his grandmother, and once held. But Jack had to beat out 10 other candidates who also wanted nomination. When Jack won the primary, Honeyfitz danced a victory jig on a table and sang his trademark song, Sweet Adeline. Jack moved to a small apartment at 122 Bowdoin Street in Boston. This remained his voting address for the rest of his life. Now he had to get to know the people of Boston's 11th district. It was a working-class neighborhood that filled men and women who put in long hours of low-paying jobs. At first, no one thought Jack could win. He didn't seem like a natural politician. Giving speeches was hard for him. He stuttered and paused, yet gradually he found the words to reach voters. He spent a lot of time in the Navy yards and docks, barber shops and grocery stores, firehouses and police stations. He listened to the stories and complaints of working men and women. Some that thought John F. Kennedy was too rich to represent them with his private schools and fine houses. How could he understand their needs to this? He replied, I have an obligation as rich man's son to help people who are having a hard time out of it. Once Jack addressed a group of Gold Star mothers, women who had lost sons in World War II. He had talked of the wartime sacrifices people made they needed for peace and the responsibility of those who survived. He ended by saying, I think I understand how all you mothers feel. You see, my mother's a Gold Star mother too. The women who heard his speech were moved. Afterward, they came up to him, and many told him how much he reminded them of their own sons. The camp against Logan Jack chose was the new generation offers leaders. He promised voters jobs, affordable housing, medical care, and veterans benefits. The promises were not much different from those made by his opponents. But Jack had the Kennedy name and the Kennedy connections, and he was a war hero. In 1944, a well-known writer, John Hersley, had written about Jack and PT 109 for a magazine called The New Yorker. Then Joe Kennedy got the article in Reader's Digest, which was read by many more people. Now Jack's name was recognized. Later, he regretted using his wartime experiences to help his campaign. There's something wrong about parlaying a sunken PT boat in a congressional seat. Jack's big family joined the campaign. His sisters Jean, Eunice, and Pat rang doorbells and handed out leaflets. His mother organized tea parties, receptions. Even Teddy Kennedy, the baby of the family at 14, ran errands for his older brother. These efforts and Jack's own were rewarded when Jack won the election. In January 1947, Jack Kennedy went off to Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, to serve in the House of Representatives. Although 29 years old, Congressman Kennedy looked like a teenager. He had serious nature of a much older man. He spoke up often and asked many questions. He was not afraid to say what he thought. Jack sponsored a housing bill to build up veterans and low-income workers, but the bill was opposed by the powerful American Legion, an organization for former members of the country's armed forces. The land sided with the real estate industry, which was against the idea of government helping with housing. The next year, Jack introduced a bill that would give government money to get rid of slums and provide decent, lower rent housing, and the Leon fought the bill. This time, Congressman Kennedy spoke out. The leadership of the American Leon has not constructive, though for the benefit of the country since 1918, the year it was founded. As energy, intelligence, and drive won him to 2 more terms in the House, even though his back continued to cause him great pain. Another blow was the death of his sister Kathleen Kick in an airplane crash. He and Kick had been so close, good friends, as well as sister and brother. Jack would continue to miss her for the rest of his life. Jack threw himself into work. His political dreams grew along with the experience, though he had entered politics with some reluctance. He wanted to help fix the problems of his country and the world. As the son of Joseph P. Kennedy, he did not have to work. Yet the desire to help others was fired in his soul. If we're going to change things the way they should be changed, we all have to do things we won't want to do, he said. After 5 years as a congressman, Jack was ready for the next step in politics. The Senate, he said, we were just worms in the House. Nobody pays much attention to us nationally. He was frustrated by how slowly things moved in the House of Representatives. It took such a long time for new laws to be made. In the Senate race, Jack traveled all across his home state to meet the voters. Sometimes his back hurt so much that he needed crutches. Jack's Republican opponent was the current Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Lodge came from another important Massachusetts family. His grandfather had also, in 1944, Lodge had resigned his Senate seat to fight in World War II. He earned a Bronze Star for bravery. Lodge would be hard to beat. Joseph S. R. told Jack, when you've beaten him, you've beaten the best. Why try for something less? Once again, all the Kennedys joined forces to help Jack win the election. Rose gave speeches to churches and civic groups. Along with her daughters, she appeared on a television program shown twice during the campaign, called Coffee with the Kennedy. Viewers could call in with questions about Jack's childhood. Jack asked his younger brother, Robert. Everyone called him Bobby, to his campaign manager. Again, all the hard work and resolve paid off. Jack won the election with 51.5% of the vote. The new senator was only 35 years old. When he was sworn into his office as senator, Jack represented the interests and needs the people of Massachusetts. He began to devote himself to issues concerning education, labor, and foreign policy. He hired 24-year-old Theodore Sorensen as a speechwriter. Sorensen was known for his liberal views and many biographers feel that he influenced Jack in his way of thinking. Jack worked so hard that he didn't have time for a wife or family. At a dinner party in 1951, he was introduced to a lovely young woman. Her name was Jacqueline Lee Bouvier. Jackie, as she was called, a refined and sensitive nature. She came to a wealthy family too. I leaned across the asparagus and asked for the date. Jackie turned him down, but they stayed in touch. Even though she was sent off to Europe, in 1952 they began dating. Jackie was working as a photographer for the Washington Times Herald. When her newspaper assigned her to England, Jack made an overseas call and asked her to marry him. She said yes. The couple was married on September 12, 1953 in a Roman Catholic church in Newport, Rhode Island. 700 guests attended the wedding. Another 600 came to the party afterward, and thousands more crowded outside the church doors hoping to catch sight of the popular senator and his pretty bride. Jackie was a good influence on her new husband. She gave up her own job because she wanted to devote her time and energy helping him. When he had lived alone, Jack often skipped meals and didn't get enough sleep, but Jackie made sure he ate well, got enough rest, and took care of himself. She also inspired him with her love of art, literature, and culture. After he fell seriously ill and needed a back operation, she was there to nurse him back to health. While recovering, Jack had time to think about the difficult decisions politicians often make. He began to write notes about how leaders can be torn between doing the right thing and keeping their jobs. His notes grew into a book. It was called Profiles in Courage. The book had 8 short biographies of senators who had shown unusual courage by supporting unpopular causes. Leaders like Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams, Sam Houston, and Robert A. Taft. They had risked careers in order to Jack in 1957. Jack's book won Pulitzer Prize for biography writing. The book made Jack think more about his own idealism and goals. He decided to seek the highest elected office in the country. Jack's great-grandfather had come to America penniless. Now, John F. Kennedy wanted to become President of the United States. Chapter 5, Mr. President. Once he was fully recovered, Jack started campaigning in his earnest. He was 42 years old. Many people thought he wasn't old enough to be the president. The president who was then in office, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had been 62 when he first elected. In comparison, Jack seemed so young. Eisenhower referred to Jack as that boy. People were used to an older man as the leader of the country. In addition, Jack was Roman Catholic. The country had never elected a Catholic president. The Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. He gives guidance to Catholics on many issues. Some people in the United States worried that a Catholic president might be influenced by the Pope. Jack urged people to put aside their worries His religion was personal. It would not interfere with being president. And speaking to a group of Protestant leaders, he said, "I believe in America where the separation of church and state is absolute. I'm the Democratic Party's candidate for president who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my children, church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." At 1960 Democratic conversation in Los Angeles, California, another man also wanted to run for president. Lyndon Johnson was a powerful senator from Texas. He had been in Congress for 23 years. He was the Senate majority leader. He argued that John F. Kennedy was young and experienced, yet despite his youth, Jack won the nomination and the man he wanted to run with him on the ticket was Lyndon Johnson. Johnson thought about it. Being vice president would give him lots of national attention. It also put him next in line for the presidency if anything were to happen to Jack. In the end, Johnson agreed to run. John Kennedy made a speech on TV to accept the Democratic nomination. He started the themes of his campaign. "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered pockets of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus." He wanted Americans to be the pioneers on that frontier. It was brilliant. It was a brilliant speech by stressing the bright promise of the future while reaching back to the pioneers' past. Jack taped the unspoken dreams and hopes of all Americans. John Kennedy ran against Republican Richard Nixon. Nixon had been vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower. He told voters that he experienced he gained in those years made him a better candidate. He wanted the government to help private businesses. In contrast, Jack Kennedy believed that the government should help make people's lives better. Jack Kennedy and Richard Nixon had a debate, and for the first time in history, the debate was broadcast on TV all across the country. Before the 1950s, most people had only radios in their home. Now millions of Americans could see the two candidates discussing issues under the harsh lights. Richard Nixon seemed nervous and uncomfortable. In contrast, Jack Kennedy seemed relaxed, handsome, and polished. After the debates were over, most people thought Jack was more impressive. In fact, in a poll of 4 million people who watched the debates, 3 million voted for Kennedy. The race, one of the closest in history. On November 8, Election Day, Jack and Jackie Kennedy went to the voting booths in Boston and cast their votes. Then they went to Hyannisport, where they found the family still had their big white summer house to wait for the results. All the Kennedys stayed up late into the night, but it was still unclear who would win. Finally, everyone went to sleep at about 2 a.m. on November 9. The answer came. John F. Kennedy was going to be President of the United States. He was the youngest man, 43, ever elected, and the first Catholic. Jack was disappointed by the narrow victory he won in 49.7% of the vote. He compared to Richard Nixon's 49.6%. Now Jack was even more determined to prove himself a great leader. The January day on which John F. Kennedy took the oath of office was bitterly cold, yet he appeared without a hat or topcoat. He wanted to project an image of strength and youth. By his side was Jackie, who had given birth to their second child and first son, John Fitzgerald. Kennedy Jr., the clan, including Jack's father, was there too. Even though Joseph Kennedy had stayed behind the census, he held many unpopular views and did not want to drive away voters. He was filled with pride at his son's accomplishment. These words, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." When the Kennedys moved into the White House, America welcomed them with open arms. The new president surrounded himself with the best and brightest people as advisors. His wife was smart, charming, and beautiful, a pattern of the arts. For the first time since the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt 60 years earlier, young Catholic children lived in the White House. Caroline Kennedy was 3, and her baby brother John was less than a year old. Jackie didn't like the children to talk to reporters or be photographed. She wanted them to have as normal a childhood as possible. But Jack liked it when the children were caught on camera. The president would often get down on floors with John in the Oval Office. Caroline also loved spending time there. They both would hide under their father's desk and take candy from the dish on the secretary's desk. Caroline once walked in during a press conference wearing her mother's high heels. The Kennedys brought animals into the White House. They had rabbits, guinea pigs, and hamsters who escaped their cages. Jack's favorite pet was a dog named Charlie. Caroline had a pet pony named Macaroni. She rode him across the White House lawn. Her father watched. Kennedy was a great storyteller. He told tales in which Caroline won horse races and John sank a Japanese destroyer in his PT boat. Kennedy also created characters called the White House who liked to eat dirty sweat socks. Jackie brought her own unique style and vision to the White House. As First Lady, she redid the White House with beautiful early American furniture and paintings. She wanted the house to reflect the country's history and be a place that was equal to the important men and women came to visit together, hosted dinners to which they invited people from all walks of life. The parties were exciting and glamorous. Jacqueline Kennedy turned the White House into a place of culture and art with a capital A C-list Pablo Picassos were a guest, as well as aviator Charles Lindbergh and composer Leonard Bernstein and songwriter Irving Berlin. Another dinner brought together American winners of the Nobel Prize, though at the time he was President John F. JFK. Supported the arts because of efforts. The National Endowment of the Arts was created, giving money to encourage artists of all kinds, actors, dancers, musicians, and architects. Jackie was equally comfortable whether hosting a poetry reading from a formal dinner, a ballet performance, or a party on board the president's yacht. When the Kennedys went to France, the First Lady met a huge hit with President Charles de Gaulle, and the French people. Jack joked that he would remember as the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris. Jack loved being president on a typical day. He was up by 7:30. He quickly read several newspapers, had a hot bath, ate breakfast, and dressed by 8:30 or 9. He was at work in the Oval Office in the basement of the White House. Jackie found a very old desk and had it moved to the Oval Office. It had belonged to President Rutherford B. Hayes. The desk was made out of wood from a ship that had been shipwrecked in 1854. President Kennedy loved the desk. The coconut shell with the carved message for help sat on top of it, a reminder of the PT-109 had been shipwrecked. Models of America's greatest sailing ships were also placed around the Oval Office. Kennedy joked about his job. The pay is good and I can walk to work. With his usual modesty, he didn't add that he gave all his salary to charity. Kennedy took care of lots of businesses by the telephone in 1961. Politics was still a face-to-face business, but JFK liked the phone because it gave him information quickly. Around noon each day, he swam in the White House pool and did exercise for his back. Then he ate lunch, a hamburger most days served on a tray. After that, he took a nap and spent an hour with Jackie. By the end of the afternoon, he was back in the Oval Office with the door open so his staff could come in and ask questions. Often he saw as many as 70 people in a single day. Most evenings he brought work home with him. There were lots of papers to read and to sign. Other nights he might attend a formal state dinner. Sometimes the Kennedys had a small dinner party for friends. Afterward, they watched a movie in the White House theater. On weekends, the first family flew to Hyannisport. Jack loved to sail and play golf there. In winter, the Kennedys visited Palm Beach, where Joe Sr. and Rose had a house. It was busy life, but a productive and happy one too. Over the years, Jack retired in many ways to ease his back pain. One doctor suggested a rocking chair. The gentle motion might help, so Jack bought a simple $30 model made in North Carolina. He found it so relaxing that he ordered several more to have one whenever he was the image of the young president in a rocking chair. Became familiar to the American people. JFK never showed the public how bad the pain was. When he needed crutches, he put them away out of sight before a speech or public appearance, and he was a big supporter of sports physical activity for Americans. He explained the President's Council on Fitness. It encouraged all Americans and old and young to lead healthy, active lives. As President, John Kennedy eagerly supported America's space exploration. He promised by the end of the 1960s an American would land on the moon. He was right. In 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. It took him 4 hours and 55 minutes to circle the planet 3 times. Kennedy believed that the United States, the richest nation in the world, had to help other poorer nations. With this in mind, the President set up Food for Peace. Cargo ships filled with food were sent to countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America where people did not have enough to eat. JFK also created the Peace Corps. Young men and women volunteered to spend 2 years in a needy country where they helped build schools, water wells, health centers, and other projects. Peace Corps volunteers also taught villagers better ways of farming their land. Right away, more than 5,000 applicants took the exam to be in the Peace Corps. By the end of 1963, 7,500 volunteers were at work in over 44 countries. By 2002, more than 165,000 Americans had served in the Peace Corps. Jack picked his sister Eunice's husband to head the Peace Corps. He also brought other family members to his administration. He asked his younger brother Bobby to be Attorney General. Bobby had run Jack's campaign for president. Now, as Attorney General, he would be the head of the Department of Justice and a member of the President's cabinet. His job would be to prosecute in federal cases. Robert Kennedy was 36 at the time. Although JFK was criticized for this, he wanted someone in his cabinet who he could trust completely. Bobby was that person. Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, did not get along with Bobby Kennedy. He often felt left out of important decisions. In 1962, the youngest Kennedy, Teddy, ran for senator in Massachusetts. He won. It was the same job that his older brother Jack had once held. Teddy was only 30. Now people saw the Kennedys as a dynasty, the more important family in the United States. Americans had strong feelings about the Kennedys. People either loved them or hated them. Chapter 6, Facing the Challenge. John F. Kennedy was president for only 3 years. He made mistakes, but he tried to learn from them too. After he took office, there was a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro. Castro was the leader of communist government in Cuba. Following World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were two superpowers. The United States was a democracy, the Soviet Union was a communist nation. Each was armed with atomic weapons. Although there was never actual fighting, the tensions between the two nations came to be known as the Cold War. The island of Cuba was only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Fidel Castro was a powerful ruler. A communist country so close to the United States was seen a threat to the United States' safety. President Kennedy okayed the plan to invade Cuba. An army of exiled Cubans landed at Cuba's Bay of Pigs. The invasion was a complete failure. More than 1,000 men were captured and imprisoned in Cuba. Others were killed. When he learned that what happened, John Kennedy spent the whole night awake and pacing the floor. As president, he took full responsibility for the disaster. All my life, I've known better than to depend on the experts, he said. How could I have been so stupid to let them go ahead? The Bay of Pigs fiasco made America look bad in the eyes of the world. Other nations accused the president of being badly informed and impulsive. The greatest crisis of Jack Kennedy's presidency began on the morning of October 16, 1962. Again, it involved the island of Cuba. The president was eating breakfast when an aide interrupted his meal. The Soviet Union had put missiles in Cuba. The missiles could strike the United States. Some advisors wanted the president to bomb the missile sites, but then war would break out between the United States and the Soviet Union. Missiles had to be removed. They posed too great danger. The country, what was JFK going to do? John Kennedy had not forgotten the Bay of Pigs disaster. He knew he had to think and act with great care. If he didn't, a war with nuclear bombs could start, a war that could destroy the world. JFK decided to block Cuba. He gave orders for 180 American ships to sail into the Caribbean. The ships formed a line of 500 miles long. No ships coming from the Soviet Union could get through Cuba, not unless if they attacked the American ships. When the Russian boats appeared on the horizon, President Kennedy and the rest of the country held their breath. What would happen? Would Russians attack U.S. boats setting off war? To everyone's relief, the Russian ships turned around and moved away from Cuba. President Kennedy spent the next few days talking with the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. The two leaders also agreed to limit testing of nuclear weapons, like the man praised in his book Profiles, and encouraged John F. Kennedy remained firm and strong in a time of crisis. He avoided war. Another issue facing the president and the country was civil rights. Slavery had ended in 1865, almost 100 years earlier, yet still black people, especially in the South, did not have the same rights as white people. In many places, blacks could not mix with whites. They had to live in separate neighborhoods, go to all black schools and churches, restaurants, stores, hotels, beauty parlors, even water fountains had signs for white onlys on public buses. Blacks were forced to sit in the back. A black person had to give up a seat to a white person if there were no other empty seats. But in the 1950s, blacks began to protest. They insisted on equal rights as citizens. In 1962, an African-American student named James Meredith tried to register for classes at the all-white University of Mississippi. The governor, Ross Barnett, denied him to the right to attend the all-white school. Many white people gathered at the university. They jeered at Meredith and called him names. They told him to turn around and go home. But Meredith instead on his constitutional right to enroll, and the next day President Kennedy called in National Guard troops to stop a riot and to protect James Meredith. During his presidency, Jack grew ever more deeply committed to the cause of civil rights. In June of 1963, he told American people 100 years of delay had passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their grandsons are not fully free. They are not freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not freed from social and economic oppression, and this nation will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. Within days of making this, Jack started planning for a civil rights bill. The bill would protect the rights of African Americans. No longer would hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, and stores be able to turn away black customers. In 1964, less than 8 months later, after John F. Kennedy's death. Chapter 7, a sudden end. The next election for president was going to be in 1964. JFK wanted a second term. By late 1963, he was already thinking about campaign. He decided to travel to Texas, the home state of Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Jack planned to make speeches to a group of businessmen. The trade mart in Dallas. He knew that many Texans had voted for Richard Nixon in the 1960 election, and they were angry over his stand on civil rights. The trip to Texas with Jackie by his side would be a good way to mend fences with these voters and gain their support. Many people close to John F. Kennedy worried about the trip. The crowds in Texas might be unfriendly, but that was not so. At lunchtime, the president's plane touched down at Dallas Airport. A large and cheering crowd came to greet JFK and Jackie, elegant, glamorous in her pink suit and matching pillbox hat. Kennedy commented, "This doesn't look like an anti-Kennedy crowd." A long procession of cars called a motorcade headed through the city. The president and his wife sat at the back of a limousine with the governor of Texas and his wife. Vice President Johnson and his wife were in another car. The president's limousine had a plastic shield to put passengers to protect them from rain. It could also deflect bullets, but Jack wanted to leave the plastic top off. It was a beautiful day. He wanted to see the crowd, and he wanted the crowd to see him. "Mr. President, will you please shake hands with me?" As the Kennedy rode through the streets of Dallas, they smiled and waved. One little girl had a sign, "Mr. President, will you please stop and shake hands with me?" Kennedy stopped the motorcade to shake hands with the girl. When the motorcade turned onto Main Street, the crowd was even larger. About 200,000 people had gathered to see the Kennedys pass by. The wife of the Texas governor, Neely Connolly, looked at the packed streets and said, "You sure can't say that Dallas doesn't love you, Mr. President." A moment later, shots rang out. Someone in the limousine shouted, "Oh, no, 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 no." The president had been hit. Jack slumped over toward Jackie. Her pink She was splattered with blood. The car sped through the streets to the nearest hospital, but it was too late. Doctors confirmed the awful news. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was dead. On a plane back to Washington, D.C., Vice President Lyndon Johnson sworn in as the new president. Jackie Kennedy stood by his side as he took the oath of office. It is now more than 40 years since JFK was killed, the terrible day in Dallas, yet everyone alive at the time remembers where they were when they heard awful news. Barely an hour and a half later, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the shooting. Then, only 2 days later, another man named Jack Ruby shot and killed Oswald right in the Dallas police station and on television news. For more than a year, evidence was gathered on the assassination. Many people did not believe that Oswald had acted alone. People in the crowd said they heard short shots coming from 2 directions, but the official report said Oswald and only Oswald was responsible for the president's death. It was as if the whole world, not just the United States, went into shock. How could something so senseless happen? And such a young, vital president, JFK's smiling face was on the front page of a newspaper on every continent. On the following Monday, the president's funeral held in Washington, D.C. World leaders came, kings and queens. The flag-draped coffin was pulled through the streets by a team of white horses. There were also a black horse with no rider. A pair of boots was placed on backward in the stirrups, the symbol of fallen leader. Dressed in a black suit and veiled, Jackie Kennedy stood with Caroline and John. As the coffin passed them, John raised his hand in a final salute to his father. The image of a little boy saying goodbye was captured in one of the most famous photographs of all time. The horses kept moving slowly. Soon they reached Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. There, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was laid to rest. An eternal flame was lit beside his grave. Like legendary King Arthur, whom he had admired as a boy, John F. Kennedy tried to be a fair, brave, and honorable leader. He inspired a nation to hope and dream of a better future. He was president for only 1,000 days, yet John F. Kennedy still holds a special place in the hearts of all Americans.